She stepped off the stagecoach with a letter in hand and no one to greet her. The wind rolled low through the dust, brushing against her skirt like a warning. The town was smaller than she'd imagined. 2 rows of buildings, a well, a church, and the long, open road curling away into nothing. Men glanced up from porches. No one smiled. No one waved. Her boots hit the dirt too softly, like she didn't belong here, like someone else was expected. The envelope crumpled in her grip. To Mr. Elijah Marlowe, it read in clean script. Promised in paper, arranged by distance. She had been his choice, and now she was here. A mail-order bride from back east, with more silence in her luggage than hope. But Elijah wasn't waiting. A man stood at the end of the road, leaning against a post. Tall, worn, weathered by the sun. His hat shaded his face, but not enough to hide the set of his jaw. Hard, uncertain. He watched her, but didn't move. She walked anyway. Not because she was brave, just because she didn't know what else to do. When she reached him, she held out the letter. "I'm looking for Elijah Marlowe," she said. The man didn't answer right away. He took the paper, read it, then looked past her, as if hoping someone else would appear. Then quiet, a breath. "He's dead," he said. 3 words, like dry wood snapping. She blinked, swallowed, looked down at her boots again. "I'm Thomas," the man added. "His brother." She didn't say anything. Couldn't. The world hadn't given her room for words. Not now. He looked at her, long, like someone counting something he didn't want to admit. "There's a room at the edge of town. You can rest there. Tomorrow I'll take you to the homestead." She nodded, because what else could she do? The room was cold, clean but bare. 1 bed, 1 window, a cracked pitcher of water. She sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at her hands. They didn't tremble. Not yet. Outside, the sky was turning to copper. Somewhere, a dog barked once and went quiet again. She took off her gloves, folded her shawl, unpacked nothing. She hadn't known Elijah, hadn't heard his voice, just the letters. But they had been kind, steady, full of a man's hopes and a farm's needs. She had read them by lantern light, thinking of a different life, and now that life was gone before it began. She laid down without undressing, eyes open. The wind tapped the glass gently, as if unsure it should be here. In the morning he came back, said nothing, just waited. She stepped outside, pulled the shawl tighter, and followed. The ride was long, dry earth and pale grass, fences that sagged, birds that scattered. The Marlowe homestead was a shape in the distance, then a door, then a silence that welcomed no one. The house was simple, a porch with 1 chair, a barn, a well. She felt its loneliness like a second skin. "This was his," Thomas said. "Yours now, I guess." She nodded again. "You can stay," he added, "at least until you figure something out." Again, she didn't answer. He didn't expect her to. That night she cooked. Out of habit, not warmth. Beans, bread, water. He ate without comment. She did too. The fire popped once. That was all. After, he said goodnight and went to the barn. She stood by the window, watching the darkness settle like dust over the field. The land didn't ask questions. Neither did he. And maybe that was why, for the first time in weeks, she slept. Morning came with bright light and the smell of wood. She woke up before sunrise. The water in the jug was ice cold, and her hands went numb while she washed her face. But it was a necessary pain, the kind that says, "You're still here." There was bread in the kitchen, fresh bread. It hadn't been there the night before. Next to it was a knife left as a sign. He didn't say a word, but he left food. That was his good morning. She went out onto the porch. The wind blew through the dry grass. Far away by the barn, he was fussing with the horse. He didn't look at her, but he knew she was watching. She remained in the doorway. She didn't interfere. He didn't call her. The day passed like this. He worked, repairing the fence, feeding the animals, checking the roofs. She washed the windows, cleaned the floors, gathered rags for washing, silently. Not because she was afraid, but because words were unnecessary here. They ate together again. Bread, beans, milk. He stared into the fire. She stared at her palms. Her fingers were rougher than before. The harshness of the earth had already penetrated her skin. Sometimes he said short things. It's going to rain. The goat needs to be sheared. I'll take you to town tomorrow if you want. She nodded, or didn't answer at all, but she heard every word he said. He slept in the barn, always, even in the cold. She slept in the house. There was no attempt to get closer, no threat, only respect. And something else, something that slowly grows in the cracks of old walls. On the third day, she washed the dishes and, without looking, left his cup upside down on the edge of the table. So he would know that she saw, that she remembered. He noticed. He said nothing, but he turned the cup back over, gently. They lived side by side, not together, not yet, but no longer strangers. Sometimes she heard him talking to the horse, quietly, almost in a whisper. These were his real words, kind, simple. She wasn't eavesdropping. She was just listening, as if she were peeking at a man who had forgotten that someone could hear him. Another day passed, then another, and one day she went out onto the porch, and he was sitting there, already waiting, not as a guest, as someone who had begun to build a new rhythm. He moved his mug. She sat down, silently, for a long time. The evening rolled down to the ground like an old sheet, warm, dusty, but familiar. And this time, she didn't leave first. The days folded into each other, quiet as laundry on a line. She learned the sound of his boots before he entered the house. She could tell how his day had gone by the dust on his shirt, the way he took off his hat, or how long he stood by the door before sitting. He never asked about her life before. She never offered. But each in their own way, they watched the past loosen its grip. One afternoon, she fixed the fence alone. Not well. The boards leaned and the nails sat crooked. But she did it anyway. When he returned and saw it, he paused, studied it, then walked away without a word. The next morning, the hammer was waiting on the porch, new nails beside it. It was the closest thing to a thank you she'd gotten. Later that week, he brought back a dress from town. It wasn't wrapped, just folded rough in a saddlebag. Simple, cotton, the kind that lasted. She didn't say anything when he left it on the table, just ran her hand across the fabric once, slowly. At night, they sat on the porch more often, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing at all. The sky stretched above them, vast and unconcerned. Coyotes howled far off. The land cooled beneath their feet. He never touched her, never tried. But when he looked at her, it was no longer like a stranger, more like a man remembering something important, or someone. She didn't smile, not yet, but the tension in her shoulders faded. Her hands moved slower when she cleaned. Her eyes softened when she watched the fields. Then came the letter. A writer brought it, stiff envelope, stamped and official. He read it outside, leaned against the barn wall and stared at it for a long time, then walked to the house and placed it on the table between them. From his lawyer, he said. Her eyes moved to the name on the seal. Elijah left you the land, all of it. She blinked, looked up at him, but he didn't flinch. You can sell it, leave, or stay. It's yours now. That night she didn't sleep, not because she was scared, but because, for the first time, the choice was hers. She didn't leave. The letter stayed folded on the table for 3 days before she moved it to a drawer. Not to forget, but to keep. Quietly, without ceremony. Thomas never asked what she decided. He just kept fixing the fence, feeding the animals, stacking the firewood like before. But something had shifted in the space between them. A permission, unspoken. That evening, she brought in his coat from the porch, hung it near the door without a word. He looked at the hook, then at her. Just once. The next day, he fixed the broken step outside the kitchen. By week's end, the barn had a new latch, and she'd sewn curtains for the front window. The wind still came through, but softer now. They weren't a couple. They weren't even friends in the way most folks understood it. But something was growing between them. Slow, rooted, like cottonwood near a dry creek. Surviving because it had to, not because it hoped. One morning she caught him looking at the field longer than usual. His hand rested on the fence rail, still as a stone. His face didn't move, but his eyes were somewhere else. Later, she found a small box on her nightstand. Inside, a comb, carved from bone, plain and smooth. No note, no explanation. She didn't use it right away, just held it. That night it rained, hard. The roof rattled and the fields turned to mud. She thought he'd stay in the barn as always, but she found him on the porch, soaked, watching the dark. She opened the door. He didn't speak, just stepped inside, dripping. She brought him a towel. He took it, nodded, sat at the table, steam rising from his shirt. She poured him tea. Neither of them looked up much, but he didn't go back to the barn that night. He stayed in the room off the kitchen, slept on the old cot, stiff and narrow. She could hear him turn once, then settle. The storm passed before dawn, but something else stayed, something that didn't wash away. In the weeks that followed, their routines held steady. She rose before him now, lit the fire, boiled water, set 2 cups instead of 1. He repaired the gate. She patched the roof. Together, without plans or questions, they made the place whole again. Neighbors came less often, maybe because they didn't understand what was happening, or maybe because they did. One afternoon, a man from town stopped by. Clean boots, loud voice, and eyes that lingered too long. Said he knew Elijah. Said she must be confused. A woman alone, holding land that didn't rightly belong. Thomas stood behind her without saying a word. Just stood, still, quiet, watching. The man left after that, quickly. That evening, Thomas placed his rifle back on the rack, then looked at her, just once. She said nothing, but her hand paused longer on the table that night, near his. Days stretched long again, warmer now. Wildflowers started to appear near the well. She planted vegetables behind the house, turned soil with her bare hands. He built a small fence around it the next morning. Didn't ask, just did it. And one night, a quiet one, she stepped onto the porch and found a name carved into the beam above the chair. Claire. She touched it like it might vanish. He never said he knew her name, but he did now, and he'd written it where she sat every evening, just above her shoulder, where the light could find it. She didn't cry, but something inside her eased, like a knot loosening in her chest. She went back inside, set out 2 plates, lit a second candle. When he came in, she looked up, and for the first time held his gaze. No words, none needed. Summer pressed into the valley slow and thick. The days grew longer, the air still. Time moved like honey, dense, golden, unhurried. They worked early to avoid the heat, shared water from the same tin cup. His hands were darker now, hers stronger. Both had changed in ways that couldn't be named, only noticed. One afternoon, she found a box of Elijah's things in the loft. Letters, shirts, a rusted watch, and a framed photograph of 2 boys standing shoulder to shoulder. Thomas looked younger, less worn. Elijah smiled with his whole face. She brought the photo down, placed it on the shelf near the window. Thomas saw it later, nodded once. That was all. They spoke more, but still rarely. Words were too small for what lived in the quiet between them. Instead, he'd place an apple on the table, and she'd slice it without being asked. She'd leave a basin by the door, and he'd wash his hands without looking at her. One evening, he returned limping, a twisted knee from hauling wood. She made no fuss, just filled a bowl and soaked a cloth. He sat silent, let her kneel before him and pressed the wet cloth to his leg. He didn't flinch. Her hands moved steady, practiced. When she was done, she stood. He caught her wrist gently, held it for a second longer than he ever had, then let go. That night, he didn't go to the cot. She didn't ask him to stay. He just didn't leave. She curled on her side, back to him, but not far. The room was warm, the windows open, and the moonlight spilled across the floor like a blanket neither of them touched. In the dark, he said one word, "Thank you." She closed her eyes, and in that moment, something settled. Not love, not yet, but the shape of it, a beginning. Harvest came early. The fields were dry but generous. Together they pulled root vegetables from the earth, laid them out in rows, dusted, sorted, stored. No words, just the rhythm of shared labor. The comfort of knowing the other would finish what you started. The root cellar filled, the shelves lined with jars. The house no longer felt empty. Neither did she. One morning, she found her old suitcase near the hearth, the one she hadn't opened since arrival, covered in dust. She opened it. Inside were clothes too fine for this land, gloves that no longer fit her fingers, letters, a brooch, a little mirror, and at the bottom, a thin photograph of a city street far away and a name scribbled on the back. Not hers, not anymore. She folded the image and placed it in the fire, watched it curl. Behind her, Thomas moved through the room, paused, then kept walking. He didn't ask what she burned. He didn't need to. Later that day, she brought out Elijah's old books and placed them on the shelf by the table. Dust rose, settled again. That evening, as she peeled potatoes, he walked in with a bundle of wood and a ring box. He didn't hand it to her, just placed it gently on the table and sat down. It wasn't fancy. Silver, worn, likely once their mother's. A small stone, cloudy but soft. Real. She looked at it for a long time, then stood, took her shawl, stepped outside. The stars were bright that night, unmoving. She walked to the fence, leaned on the post, and stayed there. For minutes or hours, she couldn't tell. When she returned, the box was still there. She didn't open it, just sat beside it, and stayed. The next morning, the ring was gone from the table. She noticed its absence the same way she noticed the changing wind. Slowly, without surprise. It hadn't been taken in anger or regret. Just moved, as if he understood she needed more time. Maybe he did too. She didn't ask where it went. He didn't offer. The morning passed in small tasks. Sweeping dust from corners, patching a rip in the curtain, boiling beans over the fire. He cleaned tools in the yard, checked the hinges on the barn doors, fed the mare. They passed each other often, never touching, but always aware. By midweek, they rode into town, together this time, one horse each, her skirt gathered modestly at her knees, his coat worn but clean. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It held something like rhythm now. At the general store, she browsed bolts of cloth without looking rushed. She paused at a muted blue, steady, cool, the color of shade under a well-built porch. She turned, and he was already behind her, a coin in his hand. He paid for it without a word, just a nod. Outside, they lingered near the water trough while she folded the fabric. A few passers-by stared longer than they should have. One man tipped his hat, but not kindly. Near the edge of the street, an old woman, bones thin as fence wire, stood in a doorway, her eyes sharp. She watched Claire carefully, then said, not unkindly, "You're not the one who was supposed to come." Claire didn't respond. Her throat was tight with dust. The woman's gaze softened. "But maybe you were the one meant to stay." Thomas heard it. He didn't turn, didn't move, but his jaw twitched once. They rode home slow, through open pasture. The sun was wide and low, and the grass swayed without hurry. A hawk circled above, then vanished behind a ridge. Neither of them spoke. That evening, Claire unwrapped the blue cloth and spread it on the table. The house glowed with a deep orange light, not from fire, but from the dusk bleeding in through the windows. She lit a candle anyway, threaded her needle, began to sew. The rhythm steadied her. In, through, pull, again. She hadn't made a dress in years, not for herself, but her fingers remembered the shape of the work. She didn't rush. Thomas moved around the house quietly, brought in wood, fed the dog, shut the windows against the night. Once he paused in the doorway where she worked. She didn't look up, but she felt him watching. He didn't speak. After a moment, he stepped away. The next day, she found herself walking toward the graves. The land had shifted around them, taller grass, fuller sky, but the names remained. Elijah's marker was worn, but firm. She knelt beside it, brushed the dirt from the letters. There was no prayer in her mind, only a kind of stillness. "Thank you," she whispered. For what, she couldn't say exactly. For the letter, for the mistake, for the man who hadn't arrived, and for the one who had. She stood, walked back slow. Thomas was on the porch, one foot propped on the railing, looking out at the field. This time she didn't hesitate, and he didn't wait. He met her halfway. The days after that moved slowly, like the tail end of summer when the heat forgets how to leave. Everything felt suspended, not stuck, just held. The house, the land, the silence between them. Claire finished the dress. It hung from a nail on the wall for 3 days before she wore it, blue against the pale wood, the hem a little uneven, the seams not perfect, but it looked like it belonged here, like she did. When she finally slipped it on, it felt like putting on someone else's skin, softer, braver, lived in. She didn't show Thomas, not on purpose, but he saw it anyway. He'd been fixing a loose shutter outside. When he turned, she was on the porch, brushing sawdust from the railing. The fabric caught the afternoon light. He didn't speak. She didn't look over, but she heard the hammer drop slowly into the dirt. That night, they ate at the table without candlelight. The air didn't need it. It was warm with something else now. He reached for the coffee pot, poured her a cup before his own. A small thing, but everything. 2 days later, he saddled both horses at dawn. No explanation. Claire stepped outside, shawl in hand, watching him tighten the last strap. He looked at her the way he always did before a word. Slow, sure, measuring her silence. Ride with me. The words weren't a question. They weren't a command. They were an offering. She nodded once, pulled herself into the saddle without help. They rode west, toward the hills. The sky stretched wide and clean, pale with early morning. The road narrowed, then turned to nothing. The air smelled of dust and sage. He didn't talk, but he didn't need to. The trail was old, forgotten. Rocks lined the edge of a shallow rise, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a creek whispered in the distance. They reached a clearing. An old foundation stood in the grass. Wood long gone, only stones and memory left. My father built here, he said, before the house, before the rest. Claire dismounted, slow. Her boots settled in the dirt like they belonged. He walked ahead, knelt beside the stones, picked up a weathered board, traced a name etched faintly into the wood. Marlowe. The way he said it, not proud, not broken, just true. This is where we learn to be alone, he added. Me, Elijah, the old man. Claire stood beside him, arms folded tight. Thomas didn't rise. He stared into the foundation like it could speak back. I buried him near here, he said. Never took anyone. Never stayed with anyone. He believed the land was enough. He looked up at her then. I thought I did too. Claire didn't move, but her breath caught in her throat. The wind passed through the clearing, light and brief. She knelt beside him, not touching, not needing to, only near. They rode back slow, no words, just the steady rhythm of hooves and breath in earth. Back at the house, she went inside first, washed her hands, started dinner. He lingered by the fence, looking out at the fields, as if seeing something that hadn't been there before. Later, he placed something on her pillow. She found it before bed. The ring, not in a box now, just the metal, warm from his hand. This time she picked it up, held it, slid it onto her finger. It fit, not perfectly, but honestly. She didn't sleep that night, not from fear, from fullness, from something finished inside her and something just beginning. At sunrise, she stepped outside. The porch boards creaked. Dew clung to the railing. Thomas was already there, hat in his lap, shirt sleeves rolled. He looked at her hand, said nothing, but his eyes softened, slow. She sat beside him, didn't speak, didn't need to. Together they watched the light spill over the dry grass, gold and thin and alive, as if the day itself had waited for them. Autumn came without warning. One morning the sky shifted, just slightly, and the breeze carried something brittle with it. Not cold, not yet, but the kind of silence that settles before leaves fall. The land stiffened, the days shortened by minutes. Claire gathered the last of the herbs, tied them with twine, hung them in the kitchen to dry. She moved slower now, not from weariness, but from knowing nothing needed rushing. Not anymore. Thomas fixed the barn roof, repaired a wheel on the wagon. He kept his hands busy, like always, but every so often she'd catch him standing still. Not thinking, just still. They shared space like breath now. One moved, the other followed. Not behind, not in front, just near. Always near. One night, a letter arrived. No writer, just a folded page, placed on the porch rail in the dark. Claire found it at dawn, the paper damp with dew. It was from Elijah's lawyer again. The town was offering to buy a portion of the land, to extend the road, to build something. A small offer, modest, enough to consider. She brought it inside, placed it on the table, didn't touch it for hours. When Thomas finally saw it, he read it slow, folded it again, then said simply, "It's not worth what it costs." And she knew he wasn't talking about money. She burned the letter that night, one corner at a time, watched the ash scatter into the hearth. Some roots don't want to be dug up again. They harvested together, what little the garden gave, enough to fill a crate, enough to last. She lined the shelves. He chopped wood for winter. The air turned sharper, the wind more certain. One morning frost lay on the windows. She lit the fire early, set his coat by the door before he asked. Later, he placed her gloves in the pocket of his vest without a word. That evening, they sat on the porch again. She wore the blue dress. He'd washed his hands, combed his hair. They didn't speak of it, but both knew what day it was. 1 year. 1 year since she stepped off the stagecoach with a name not yet hers, a future not yet real. She watched the sky fade, clouds curling along the horizon. "I thought I'd be gone by now," she said quietly. Thomas turned toward her, eyes steady. "I didn't think you'd stay." Neither smiled, but something warm passed between them, like coals under ash. That winter came hard. Snow lined the fence posts but didn't bury them. The wind howled, but the house held. Claire made stew most nights. Thomas added more logs to the fire than he used to. They didn't sleep apart anymore. Not out of need. Out of knowing what it meant to be cold and what it meant not to be. He built a second shelf for her books. She taught him how to mend his own shirts. Some nights they spoke. Most nights they didn't. Words had become unnecessary. Their story wasn't written in speech. It lived in motion, in care, in choice. Spring came late, the thaw slow, the creek louder, birds louder still. Claire planted again, not to survive, but to stay. One afternoon she stood on the porch, fingers in the pockets of her apron, watching the field, the horizon. Thomas came beside her, took off his hat, scratched his jaw. "We could build another room," he said. She looked at him, brow raised. "For what?" He paused, thought, then shrugged. "In case someone shows up." She smiled. The first full one. Small. Real. Her eyes glinted with it. "You expecting company?" she asked. He shook his head. "No," he said, "but I wasn't expecting you either." She leaned her shoulder against his. He didn't move away. The sun dipped low, casting everything in the color of promises, kept too quietly to be noticed by the world. A breeze passed through the tall grass. The house behind them stood straight, still modest, still quiet, but it held warmth now. A name carved into the porch beam, a blue dress hanging by the fire, a ring on a finger not offered in haste, but in time. Claire closed her eyes, not to escape, just to remember, to breathe. This wasn't the life she was promised. It was better, because it was hers.